Hello, and welcome to the Personality Junkie Podcast. I'm AJ Drenth.
And I'm Elaine Shallock. Hey, Personality Junkies. We are going to be talking today about, specifically about thinking types and their experiences in relationships and some of the key points and issues that come up for those who are T types, either T dominant or even T auxiliary, in navigating relationships. And I think we want to open by kind of talking about, I think it's worth at least noting the gender stereotypes of the various preferences. T and F, the T and F, the thinking and feeling preferences, are the only ones that seem to have some sort of correlation, generally speaking, with gender. More T types are men, and more F types are women. That's the only, what we would consider statistically significant preference between men and women, generally speaking. And so there is a gender stereotype there associated with T types or thinkers more commonly being men, and F types, feelers, more commonly being women. But this is by no means, an absolute hard and fast rule. The number breakdown is somewhere in the ballpark of about 75% of men are thinkers, about 75% of women are feelers, and so that still leaves, a quarter of the male population respectively being, feelers, and about a quarter of the female population being thinkers. And so we just wanted to put that forward. Probably most people have already heard that statistic, but we felt like we would be remiss not to at least mention it as we move forward. But in the framework of this podcast, when we are referring to thinking types, I mean, we're referring generally, doesn't matter men or women in relationships, if they are a T type or a thinking type. So in case it wasn't explicitly clear, when we're talking about relationships, this is something that's largely in the F domain, and I realize we haven't had a podcast yet that sets out to kind of really clearly define the qualities of thinking and feeling. And so most readers or listeners, I think, are probably relatively aware of that. But so within the context of this podcast, we're talking about what it is to navigate a relationship, which is really an F thing or a feeling type of strength. It's something we commonly associate with feeling for a T type. So in a way, we're kind of talking about this as if, relationships in the context of thinkers is maybe more of a struggle or something a little bit more challenging for them as they're naturally thinking dominant. And so that's the understanding we're going to use as we go into more depth with this podcast.
So one of the key things going into this conversation that we need to kind of preface things with is to realize that for thinking types, that means that their feeling function is inferior, or it comes after their feeling or their thinking function in their functional stack. And another way of putting that is to say that their F function or their feelings are often more subconscious than they are for feeling types. So
Right.
You often hear it said that thinkers have a hard time, knowing what they feel or getting in touch with their feelings.
Right.
And did you want to comment on that, Elaine?
Well, yeah, this goes into the discussion we've had about the functional stack and where things line up. As you move down the functional stack from the dominant function, which is the more conscious of the functions and something that, we find as a natural strength, something we work with regularly, and then go down through auxiliary, tertiary, and then inferior function. The further down, if it's down in the inferior function, the less conscious or the more suppressed something is, and so it's something with which we're not very comfortable. It's an area that we often feel a bit childlike or helpless to navigate because it's
Right.
because it's unclear.
So sometimes it's likened to handedness. So, a strong thinker in a relationship may feel, in some senses, like he or she is writing with his, non-natural hand, his non-preferred hand. And so there can be a sense of awkwardness as a result. Maybe one's partner is expressing feelings or displaying feelings, and the thinker is left not really knowing how to respond appropriately. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that his feeling function, which is his weaker hand or his weaker tool, if you will, is more difficult for him or her to use and to be aware of. What's interesting, though, is it's not that thinking types never have feelings. I think a good example of this is the infatuation phenomenon. All types, even thinking types, can become deeply infatuated, almost to the point of being,
obsessive at times.
Obsessive.
And romanticizing, relationships or the ideal person or relationship, and
put someone up on a pedestal,
right.
and almost worship the ground that they walk on. So that there's obviously the imagination can play a fantastic role in really
like feeding the feelings that are being pulled up from the inferior function. Once a T-type has become aware that feeling is there, it can start to seem all-consuming almost. And that's kind of the nature. We aren't going to go too deeply into, the ins and outs of the inferior function, but it's important to understand that, because the inferior function, again, it's this kind of dark, power that it has over us to kind of come up. It feels like it kind of comes up out of nowhere and then takes over at times. And so that, in the case of feeling areas, that can be more true for thinkers. So thinking types may spend most of their waking time just naturally, the natural inclination is spend that time immersed in, in more analytical thought or kind of detached from the feeling. So it's more business or mindfulness of things besides their
But
feeling.
then someone comes along and
like kind of stirs up
this whole new world. I mean, it's as a thinking type myself, I can attest that there's kind of a certain time in life when suddenly you discover these feelings, and whether it's a crush on someone at school, or an all-out infatuation that's just fed by the imagination, it can be like you said, Elaine, a little bit, it can become an obsession at some point, because it's this whole new world of experience that is totally unlike one's normal mode of operation.
Right, and I want to bring up in that, to that end, that what you're also describing is that phenomenon of the inferior function providing kind of the first glimpse, perhaps, and I would say this is especially true, when T-types reach, maybe, that first stage of their first crush or whatever it is, maybe, junior high school, kind of as they enter their teenage years. This can be, kind of a particular time when you see that. It's like the first major experience they have with the inferior function in a really, like, salient, real way to them. And so that pulls them in a way they've never experienced. But the lure of that, without even being conscious of it, the lure of that is that what that represents to them, that doorway or that pathway to a relationship, is in a very real way, the self perceives that as the answer to how to feel whole, because it represents regaining balance over the self and reclaiming some of the energy that has been sort of poured into thinking for most of the life of the thinker, and reclaiming some of that back via feeling, which has been repressed. And so that represents this wholeness, that attainment of something that is going to give us this sense of wholeness. And then psychologically speaking, that experience is always wrapped up in a feeling of excitement and well-being and anticipation and optimism, because there's that sense that I can be made whole, I can be made more complete if I can just kind of recoup this lost part of myself that has been kind of buried in the subconscious. And that is really what feeling represents
for the thinker.
Especially a dominant thinker. It's still true to a lesser extent, but still true for those with thinking in the auxiliary position, but it's particularly noticeable if you're a thinking dominant.
So the object of a thinker's infatuation, the individual that he or she is infatuated by, is in fact is functioning like a symbol.
Right.
It's a symbol of hope and sort of completeness or redemption or individuation for the thinking type, because seeing that or experiencing that infatuation is a signpost of the way to wholeness, or at least even if the thinker doesn't call it that or realize that's what it is, that is in fact psychologically speaking kind of what is happening.
Right.
Now, whether or not that is an accurate representation of how to bridge the gap from thinking to feeling is another question, and we can get into that, because there's a lot about that infatuation experience that is not it's not real in many senses.
And to be clear,
it's greatly hyperbolized and idealized.
And to be clear, this infatuation experience, I mean, we hear that word often in terms of a relationship. It really isn't just about relationships. All the types experience to some degree, with respect to the inferior function, an infatuation with whatever it is that most symbolically represents the preference that's been buried down in the inferior function.
Exactly.
So infatuation for an N dominant like myself could look like an infatuation with S things like beautiful possessions or sensory experiences like traveling, seeing new places, or having beautiful things, or buying things, or having money. Anything that is symbolically representative of the kind of peak essence of that preference. So,
right.
I mean, but returning back to the subject at hand, yes, in the case of thinking types, we're talking about F infatuation, which is, again, largely tied up in relationships and becoming sort of consumed by a relationship. And I would say it's particularly strong maybe the first time a T-type has this run-in with this feeling or a crush. And in some ways you get the sense that they become kind of blindsided by it, because it seems to come up out of nowhere, and then feel like they can't stop thinking about it or obsessing or worrying about it.
Suddenly the thinker, for the first time in his life, has the desire to write poetry or to write music or join a band, and he's suddenly listening to love songs all the time and
right.
doing things that
typically very out of character that would typically be very out of character for the T-type, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But so understanding that, you have to understand that that's one side of the puzzle. Is there's this excitement, there's this energy and optimism and hopefulness that comes with the idea that a relationship might be approaching for the T-type, and then at the same time there's this kind of fear or anxiety, I would maybe say, about how on earth, now knowing that you have these feelings kind of being stirred up in you, do you begin to navigate what to do with those feelings, how to express those feelings or share those feelings. And so then that's where that pull, that kind of push-pull and that inner struggle comes in.
Right. How do you gain the love of your the object of your infatuation? I know many T-types who at that stage of their life start visiting the self-help aisles and hoping they can, through a T way, i.e. reading or watching how to guides online, how they can go about more effectively navigating the world of relationships and maybe appearing less awkward, or learning how to have easier conversations with people, or
even about them. I mean, I would say for F types, there's sort of the natural inclination to share feelings with friends and other fellow F types, where you might be able to say, oh, I'm really interested in so and so, and this is what's been happening, and how might I approach them, and here's how I'm feeling. And so I think that's something that comes more naturally for F types, and so they get a handle on those feelings, and they feel comfortable talking about those feelings with others to use as a sounding board for how they might navigate. But as T types, I think there's a little bit of feeling like, you're out at sea without a life raft, and where do you even begin to grasp first to figure out where to go with those feelings?
Exactly. Another thing that I think is relevant is kind of thinking about what happens after a T-type has settled down into a relationship, or perhaps has made some sort of commitment. And the T-type will often discover that those initial feelings of infatuation have diminished.
And greatly sometimes. I mean, things can go from extreme infatuation and then drop off very suddenly into a complete disconnect. That's something that you see happening more with T-types because of the burial of F in the inferior function. It's sort of like when they, when things are good and the feelings are positive and have that, that sense of infatuation or great love and so forth.
And not only that, but of possibility,
right.
Like where might this lead? It's there's such a strong ideal about, it feels like, the future is so bright, so optimistic. And so once the T-type has entered into a committed relationship, it can feel like that sense of possibility is diminished because more things have been crystallized in the relationship. There's
and that. Let's be clear. What that does is it essentially sucks energy away from F. It's pulling that libido. This is why understanding Jung's work on typology is so important. It's a pulling of that libido or energy that's been subconscious or repressed energy away from F, and doing that, bringing these things into consciousness or to bring them up in the psyche and to crystallize them, makes their power over us that much weaker. And so I think when T-types begin to realize this, they kind of, have this ability to just shut it down fully. And
it can almost freak us out sometimes, because it's like, wow, I had such strong feelings. Where did they suddenly go?
They're gone. Right.
And so it can lead to almost, I think at times the proverbial midlife crisis is partly related to this. I used to have such strong feelings for him or her, and now those feelings are gone, and so something must be wrong. And so I think what that does is it should lead the thinking type to start asking, well, is the goal to be chasing after these feelings, or are there other reasons for being in the relationship, or is there a more mature or sustainable way of approaching relationships where it's not just about getting the next infatuatory high, so to speak?
Well, and let's be fair. I think to some extent that experience of, becoming overwhelmed by your feelings of love or romance in the initial stages of a relationship, and then recognizing that, it sort of drops down to a lesser level, and then kind of trying to figure out, well, now that some of this kind of initial infatuation is gone, should I continue to stay in the relationship? Should I not? I think these are problems that happen frankly, for all types. It's not just T-types. Definitely not. This happens for F-types as well. But I think that you see the extremity to the level, that it's at with T-types more often than you maybe do with F-types. And I think F-types maybe tend to learn earlier on that that's a natural part of the cycle of a relationship, that there's always sort of an initial attraction and rush of adrenaline and hormones and biology kicks in and a desire for sex kicks in, and that's partly biological. It's not strictly about being a T type or anything. So that happens to all types, but what I do see happen more frequently with the thinking types is that the cycle repeats itself. It is very common for a T type to get into a relationship and they're all in. I mean, it's like so
Head
in
over
love,
heels.
head over heels. They're all in. The feeling disappears, or one thing happens that maybe kind of rubs them the wrong way, and they don't even know why, maybe, that kind of turns them off. Then they're out and they're looking at the possibility of another relationship. Suddenly, when they find that feeling experience again of, oh, like, this is wonderful, now I remember what being in love was like, or I remember what infatuation was, and then they go all in on this one until something, kind of pulls the rug out from under them there, and then they're back to this cycle. And I mean, I've seen it go on over and over and over and over, like serial relationshiping.
Well, when the F function is in the inferior position, it's a gargantuan challenge to really develop that function.
Yes.
And to be able to use it effectively in the relationship to both get what you want and also please your partner.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it seems easier to just jump ship,
cut your losses,
cut your losses,
mm-hmm.
and start over.
Mm-hmm.
And there in doing that, one can get that rush of infatuation again. And I think it's maybe easy for the thinker to say, well, it's not me, it's just must be the wrong person or
right.
something like that, instead of looking at oneself and saying, I need to do some serious work here if I'm going to ever manage to have a long-term successful relationship with someone.
Yeah, I would say that it's fairly common to see T-types putting a lot of the responsibility and energy onto their partners. There's a lot of expectation that the partner is not doing something. If the feeling of love or interest has sort of disappeared, it's on the partner. Well, you didn't do enough to continue to kind of keep my F interests going. Ergo, the problem maybe is really with the partner, which is certainly probably not always fair. However, we understand that that's a process that is a normal psychological process, because of that sense as a T-type that there's little that you could do as a T-type, or that the T-type could do to try to rectify the relationship, since they don't have the conscious strength of feeling. It's so much easier to project it onto the partner. Like, you didn't keep my interest in the relationship long enough. And so if the partner fails them or doesn't continue to provide that kind of optimism and excitement and the positive feelings coming, the interest just sort of disappears and they move on to wherever the next source is.
Exactly. I think it's probably worth discussing the different T types, whether they're NT types or ST types, and the roles that the SN and maybe the JP variables play in relationships as well. I think as these types grow and are, participate in more relationships over the course of their lives, if they're introspective at all, they start realizing that, some characteristics in their partners are more important or valuable to them than others. Mm-hmm. And that's not always apparent in the infatuation phase. The infatuation can be based on any number of things, but even just physical attractiveness
right.
can play a huge role. And if we jump to look at the NT types, for instance, physical attractiveness, while it may be something they value to some extent, is almost on the opposite pole of what they ultimately end up valuing in a partner, which is, someone who enjoys discussing ideas and what David Kiersey calls a mind mate. They often end up looking for someone who can kind of meet and convene with them in the intellectual sphere, if you will, and
Right.
So pursuing someone just because he or she is attractive or has a magnetic personality is not going to most likely satisfy the NT type in the long run. And so I think that can be a huge revelation for some personality types, that trying to reconcile that initial sense of infatuation with their NT nature.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be a little bit confusing and trying to kind of figure out where do I go with relationships, or what am I really after? Am I after those feelings, or am I after intellectual conversation? And
Well, and I think you just made a really good point, which is that all if T types want to move beyond sort of this pattern of like serial dating, that sounds very negative, but
serial monogamy, sometimes called.
oh yeah, okay, beyond that, but if they want to move beyond that pattern of kind of falling in love, falling totally out of love, falling in love, and actually find something that goes beyond the infatuation phase, they're going to have to look at these questions about what is going to be more sustainable in the long run, because the infatuation it's a guaranteed short-term experience with every relationship, and then that's why they fall into the trap of continuing to try to go in and out of relationships seeking that same feeling until they get bored or whatever and move on. But T types, and this is so true, we get so many readers, I feel like, writing in about T types, writing in about relationship issues that struggle here, and I think that they recognize and want to know what they can do or what's going to help them have a successful relationship, because so many of them are not happy with that pattern of relationships sort of falling apart after it seems to be going so well initially, and then from that to nothing. And so understanding that for a T type, a relationship ultimately has to be less about the feeling, at least initially, has to be less about the feeling of infatuation and more about, these sort of other foundational elements, such as, like Drew said, finding someone who's a mind mate and they can enjoy talking about things with.
Or for STPs, maybe someone you can go out and have a good time with in playing sports or playing games or having
or
fun,
traveling, or there's all kinds of other ways to find a compatibility and a basis for a relationship or a friendship that goes beyond I took one look at him or her and I was totally in love or infatuated, and there's something that I can't even put. It worries me when I hear T types say, I can't put my finger on what it is. They just bring up these feelings in me, and so.
So would you say that initial attraction, like what you might call, an immediate or quick attraction to someone, is less dangerous for an F type somehow than it is for a T type? Are T types more apt to get themselves in a bad situation by trusting those early or initial feelings than an F type?
Yeah.
Because you might say that F types are maybe better like when an F type is experiencing something in that way, there is maybe more reality, or there's more. The F type is better equipped to sense F things in a real way than the T type, who's more apt to just kind of blow things out of proportion, maybe. Or...
Right. And I've seen it happen that F types say, like, they feel feelings of love or interest for somebody, and those feelings seems like in some ways they can be a little bit more sustainable, at least the initial ones, than for T types. But that down the road, those feelings are justified later for T reasons, like that this, the F-type's partner is, provides a number of things that are important to them on a rational, has a good job, or shares the same interests and so on. So they might do a better job in maintaining that relationship down the road, even though, again, most relationships are going to probably start with some of this sort of infatuation,
initial chemistry.
Initial chemistry. But for what we're saying here with respect to T types is that, a T-type has to get used to the idea that that initial chemistry is going to wear off, and for them probably fairly quickly, actually, and that when that happens, what are you left with? And do you want to continue the relationship despite the fact that sort of intensity of infatuation and feelings is lesser?
So it is sort of the wisdom for T-types here, I think, as if T-types enter and exit enough relationships to where they can see that this is happening, that will bring about more prudence and judiciousness as far as the selection process up front. So it changes their criteria, is what I'm trying to say, so that you're no longer just looking for chemistry or beauty, but you have a better sense of what the meat is, I guess, that you're really looking for in the relationship, whether it's an intellectual camaraderie
or a spiritual
camaraderie, things that because those are the things that are going to be more sustainable and maintainable for the thinking type in the relationship, I think.
Right, and I would also add to that this issue of communication. A good, it's not uncommon for T-types to partner with F-types, and, what the F-type would bring to a T-type is the ability to maybe help the T-type get in tune with what's going on or with their feelings. And it may happen that the T-type doesn't know that they're, not consciously anyway, that they're starting to shut off feeling, or that they are scared because the feeling of love and infatuation that started there is kind of waning and disappearing, and so they don't, either they're not even fully conscious of it, which I think is true for T-types, for many T-types, or maybe they are conscious of it, but that frightens them, and so then they don't know how to express that to the partner, and then there's a fear that now I'm going to stir up all of this F trouble by telling my partner my feelings are disappearing. And so what they do at that point often is to repress even further, and so then they withhold and they fail to communicate to their partner.
Well, there's a fear that you're either going to hurt your partner, or you're going to be maybe rejected or
left alone,
which
is a fear of a lot of T-types too.
Which is a fear as well, for revealing your true fears or concerns about the
sustainability of the relationship.
Right. I mean, because the F-type maybe doesn't have that quite the same level of diminishment of the feelings, so maybe the thinker is concerned that, I know that she loves me, but I'm, my feelings seem to have waned, so if I tell her that, what's going to happen? And so there's a sort of...
And I want to give a little bit of, support here to the T-type, because a lot of sort of not so positive things have been said about these experiences of T-types in a relationship, but this is a really scary experience for a T-type, and so you have to have some measure of compassion and understanding that to sort of suddenly be left with this realization that feelings that you thought were there are suddenly not there, and now you don't know what to do, and you're in a relationship and you have no idea how to try to put... I think of it like banking, right? You're putting money in the bank, like F money, like maybe at first at the beginning of this relationship, it seemed like, your bank account was full and you had money to spare and it was bursting at the seams. And then, suddenly you look and, oh my gosh, you're, at almost a zero balance and there's nothing there. And then how do you go about trying to replenish the account, when you've just kind of spent through this money? And as a T-type, that is so unnatural. Like we were saying, it's like, handedness. It's like using your opposite hand, navigating. What do you do now that you've depleted the F bank account, or now that somehow the F bank account is magically devoid of any, feeling money in the bank anymore? And so it's really frightening for them, because I think ultimately T-types don't want to have to hurt somebody. They don't want to hurt their partner. And this may be viewed as somewhat cowardly, but again, if we're being fair, this is something we all do with respect to the inferior function, and so they don't know where to go with that or what to do. And then what's worse is they feel like they can't even express that to their partner, who, if their partner happens to be an F-type, may or may not be able to kind of assist them in the process of working out, well, let's talk about the lack of feelings that are, that you're experiencing that aren't the feelings that aren't here that maybe were before. Let's talk about why you're having maybe not even a lack of feelings, but negative feelings. You used to feel, hope or excitement, but now you're feeling annoyance or anger at me. Where's that coming from?
Right.
And to help the partner be able to kind of even recognize that those feelings are
well,
coming up.
not only that, but sometimes the partner, especially if an F type is the T type's partner, is going to register and kind of be aware of that this is maybe happening in the T type, and so he or she may be showing less sexual interest, and the T type may not like that or not understand what's happening. And so that can just further fuel the problems as well, because the F type is essentially reflecting in some ways whatever the T type is experiencing, and maybe not even aware that he or she is experiencing.
Right, and that's where you see again, we get the T types, the readers writing in about some of these issues that they very often experience as sort of, well, there was just a total breakdown of communication. I as the T type was afraid to share that I felt like my attraction was diminishing, or I didn't know how to deal with the lost feelings that were going away, and then I felt my partner kind of tune that out, or and then because I couldn't talk about it with him or her, that eventually this kind of invisible wall goes up. And I mean, that's a very common problem in relationships, but this invisible wall goes up, nobody's communicating, and next thing you know, two people feel like strangers, who previously had these, strong and exciting and intense emotions for each other, and they feel as if they really don't even know each other anymore. And so, again, this is sort of a two-sided thing. I mean, ideally, the T-type can be with a partner, either an F or another T-type who maybe has had enough experience and maturity, in their life and with their other relationships to know how best to help that T-type navigate this murkiness of the feeling question when feelings kind of disappear. But it's also the responsibility of the T-type, and I think more in bringing consciousness to the fact that it's easy and comfortable to repress, and it's easy and comfortable, like when we see the bank account is at zero, maybe we just don't even want to look. I don't want to know. I don't want to know that I have no money in there.
I can testify that, especially if the T-type is busy with other things like work, dealing with relationship problems is, kind of the last thing you want to do, because it honestly takes so much energy to do that for the T-type. And especially at the end of a long work day, you're tired out, your partner wants to maybe talk about the relationship, and all you want to do is sit down and watch Netflix. There's
no gas left in the tank.
There's no gas left in the tank, and it can just be or asking the T-type, why don't you sit down and think about the relationship, and think about some.
It's like asking an N-type to sit down and worry about their taxes. I mean,
right.
It's anything but.
Exactly. The T-type just wants the relationship to almost come magically, like the infatuation did, or it should take care of itself. I don't want to have to invest time in maintaining it. So that's a big challenge.
That's the struggle, and that's the struggle for all personality types with their, with respect to their inferior function. Eventually, I think T-types reach a point of exhaustion, and they get tired of the relationships never working out, or going through this, repetitive cycle of infatuation to, disintegration, infatuation, disintegration. They get tired of that, and they decide, maybe I have to do a little bit more kind of ongoing housekeeping with respect to my relationship, maybe not funnel this huge amount of effort in one sitting, but maybe there are small things I can do daily to bring mindfulness to the relationship, and maybe there are ways in which I can, sort of gently continue to grow and nurture the relationship, but without feeling like I have to exhaust, every last drop of gas in the tank to do it. And then again, having a partner that is understanding of that, is a huge, support for the T-type in a relationship, because it takes a very special kind of person to understand that we're talking about T-type's handicap when it comes to relationship. And I've seen it happen so many times, especially when it's an F-type in a relationship with a T-type, and the F-type has these expectations about what the T-type should be contributing, because let's be real, they're projecting what is true and natural for them as F-types. It's, to invest in the relationship, remember the birthdays, remember the special events, do things that show a constant act of love, continue to water the garden of their relationship, if you will. And then they get disappointed because the T-type clearly isn't, putting in the same level of effort or making that the top priority. And so the expectations begin to rise for the person in the relationship with the T, that, wow, like, this T-type's not really meeting those expectations. Then frustration sets in, and as frustration sets in, the T-type picks up on this negative feeling, and negative feelings cause the T-type to clam up, run, go away, because it's bad and it's not good feelings. It's the kind of thing they don't want to deal with. And so again, this wall comes up, and I mean, boy, that's the story of like so many marriages. I can't even begin to describe it. Right?
Would you say that communication is the key tool for an effective relationship? Then is that how thinkers and feelers ultimately connect and get on the same page, is through talking? And
well, I don't want to project here. I think that's especially true for N types, NTs. Communication is maybe more important sometimes through acts of service, and this is where kind of the love language discussion comes in. There's different ways of expressing your love. That that can also be a way that like ST types may be more apt to show their love and appreciation. But I'm always let's be real, I'm always in favor of communication. And if you don't communicate, you can't bring light to those things which have previously been sort of opaque, in the subconscious.
Is it unfair to expect an STP to become a master of communication in a relationship?
To some extent, I think it is. Yeah. I don't think that. I think it's probably a little bit more natural for an NTJ or an NTP to be more of a communicator than a doer, but. So it might take a little bit less, little less actual information, but you might see the STP being more act oriented and see them making the changes, like remembering to, take out the trash, on a weekly basis because that's significant to their partner, And if an ST type is with a partner who cares about those types of S things, and that's the love language or the communication with which they speak, then all the better. Then they're going to have an understanding of each other and with each other, that, it might not look exactly the same as an NT in a relationship. An NT in a relationship, especially if it's with another N, it may be less about, are you taking out the trash every week, and more about, are you making time to sit down and check in with me and see, and ask me how I'm doing, or that sort of thing.
Right. So that would seem to speak to the value of maybe understanding the love languages, or even just understanding the personality types, because if we can understand, that my partner is an STP, and that because of that he or she is maybe more inclined to show love through action. If we can understand the general tendencies and proclivities for each of the types, then we can have more empathy for our partners, and we can almost approach our partners in a certain way based on what we know about them and their type. So
right. And I would say that, probably the healthiest thing that T-types can do or understand, the best thing for T-types to try to understand, is that a relationship is a work in progress. Just like your career. I mean, you're constantly, kind of working on new projects and kind of honing your craft, honing your skill, improving, your job position. And maybe you take a step back and take a new job, but then you kind of go forward, and it's a work in progress. And a relationship is not any different. And if T-types could sort of wrap their mind around, a relationship in that way, that instead of expecting to suddenly just get the job of their dreams and have this, massive promotion and, make millions overnight, like that this is something it's a craft that you really hone and work on over time.
And it's helpful to have a partner, I think, who's willing to acknowledge that as well, and to be patient with the T type and support and maybe do a good job of noticing even the small steps that he or she is taking toward, showing that they're investing in the relationship and trying to, make the effort. And
recognition matters to T types. I mean, especially those with TI, but it does matter. They want to hear their partner saying, "Oh, I noticed that you did this and that meant a lot to me. I really appreciate," or to hear words of gratitude and affirmation about, what they're doing right. That is encouraging to T types. And, I've heard it again and again, if a T type doesn't feel like they're being appreciated or doesn't feel like they're being, acknowledged or honored or treated with respect and, gratitude for the ways in which they're trying to, to help foster the relationship, that so easily can cause them to just disconnect. Like, well, all right, I'm not appreciated. The feeling shuts down. They step back. And before you know it, again, that sort of invisible wall comes up. And it's just so easy for the T-type, once they disconnect from their feelings, to, sort of walk away and keep that wall there, because they just trying to get back over it, trying to recoup the feeling just feels so incredibly difficult.
And I think ego defenses play a big role too, in the degree to which a T-type is even going to be open to the idea that he or she may be, doing something wrong or could do something better in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but just like you were talking about, maybe he's feeling like he's not getting the affirmation he needs or the praise that he needs to feel good about himself. That too is kind of an ego problem, because he's, not that we don't all want to be supported, but demanding that constant, almost being patted on the back from one's partner. And if not, I'm going to, react against her or something like that.
Right. Ego defenses are something that affects every relationship. Nobody likes being criticized. Nobody likes being told they're wrong or doing something wrong in a relationship. This goes for F types and T types. But T types in particular, when it comes to issues about the relationship, and if they're criticized with respect to how they're doing in the relationship, you're not showing enough love, or you're not,
that can be a sensitive
my goodness,
area.
That can be so incredibly sensitive, and nothing, riles up a...
Well, I make the money, I work hard, I do all this, and...
Yep.
And so
the T weaponry comes out to fight the sort of F deluge or onslaught of like criticism.
Right. There's a reaction as though one's being criticized for being, a complete failure in all regards, when all the partner was trying to do is maybe say, this is one small thing that you can improve or work on, and there's this big reaction, and that's an
ego defense.
It's an ego defense.
Yes.
And it's obviously very difficult to make progress in a relationship if that's happening on a regular basis. And that's often when people, I think, start to seek out counseling, because
it becomes habitual. Being in a constant state of defense becomes habitual, and so eventually, maybe it only happens a few times early on, and the defense goes, well, I don't understand why, you can't just appreciate what I do here. And then it kind of slowly over time, the more of these kinds of, dings or knocks that the T-type feels like they're getting with respect to what they're doing wrong in a relationship, they become permanently...
Resentment starts to build.
Resentment builds. They become permanently defensive. And that's where, yes, very often you see people trying to turn to counseling, what can be done, at that point, to try to salvage what's happened there. And that ego defense state is something that all types, if on their journey toward individuation and self-betterment, can do better by being aware of. Anytime the ego gets riled up, we have to ask what's going on here and why, and it's probably related to the inferior function. So bearing that in mind.
So that's sometimes a good sign that the ego is involved with T-types, is when they start to feel something, they start to feel angry, they start to feel sometimes rage or hostility toward their partner, and in an ego sense, that can somehow feel good to the thinker because it almost feels justified. I have this strong emotion welling up, and so it's like the emotion justifies their response, when in fact it actually shows that the thinker has kind of, in some respects, lost control of him or herself, because he's no longer acting in his most conscious function, i.e. using thinking and actually being rational, but is now suddenly being fueled by this, unconscious welling up of emotions, and it suddenly is really no longer in control.
Well, let's bring that full cycle, right? Because we started out by describing that feeling of infatuation early on for T-types, and this is not, this is kind of the opposite, but same, these sort of dichotomous opposites. Infatuation, or extreme love, but without, sort of without ration, or without, and without control, that feeling that takes over you isn't really that different from this, like, extreme anger, or, you even use the word rage. I mean, whoa, that's harsh, that's extreme, but I do wager that T-types feel that, they can reach that point, but it's like, almost in a strange way, both are equally energetic or charging, give this emotional jolt or charge and do something for the self, that extremity of emotion, either extreme infatuation or extreme rage or anger. And both of those provide this, almost wake-up call that says, yes, I have feelings. And that's like what you hear. It's like the ego saying, I have feelings. I am a feeler. And that's the T-type's way of trying to, again, find this part of themselves that's been lost, and to regain the feeling side to their strong thinking side. And so even though it seems, like, who would want to feel the feeling of rage or anger? It's such a negative feeling, but for the T-type who's experiencing it a la the inferior function, it's, in a sort of twisted way, represents something that actually feels, I dare say, good, or feels invigorating, maybe is a better word, because it represents, still this opportunity to even have feeling at all, which means I have the potential to be whole, or I have the potential to be complete,
right,
if you will.
Right.
And so wherever the feeling, whether it's infatuation or rage, the addiction of the feeling, God forbid a T-type get into a cycle. I mean, it's bad enough to be in a cycle of infatuation, but worse yet, arguably, to be in a cycle of, like, constant anger, or, bitterness or rage or whatever it is. So anyway, we've covered a lot of ground here. And I mean, I think we've made some points as to what T-types can do to try to, rethink how they approach a relationship, some positive things. And maybe we've also brought understanding to those in relationship with a T-type. This isn't just for T-types. Hopefully anyone in a relationship with a T-type can kind of come to understand how their partner works, and maybe some of what's going on with them, and maybe show a little bit more understanding and compassion, and find an avenue to begin to try to communicate.
And it sometimes helps to recognize your own weaknesses in the relationship, so your own inferior function issues. Perhaps, if you're an F dominant, you would have inferior T issues, and so those things will come up in the relationship. Well, why didn't you get the taxes done, or why didn't you get,
you forgot to pay, like, telling an F type, you forgot to pay a bill,
or something along those lines, or you overspent the account, didn't you do the calculations right, or something, and so there are these weak points in each person, and so if you can just think of your own weaknesses and then kind of relate those to those of your partner, and they're just take a different form, and that can be sometimes useful for engendering empathy and ways of maybe talking more sort of equally about the relationship. We can talk about your weaknesses and we can talk about mine, and
but that requires the lowering of the ego defenses, and that's the sort of the brilliant part about personality type, is that as soon as you have that language in your arsenal that you can say, oh, this is my inferior function F reacting negatively to this situation, you take the power away. You take the power of the ego away to continue to get kind of energized and riled up by it. And suddenly you're now in a place where you're even capable of communicating with somebody about it or dealing with it in a way that isn't, subjectively tinted by this ego defense that you're experiencing. And so that's really what two people in a relationship want from each other, is they don't want to be in a state of ego defense. They don't want their partner to be in a state of, ego defensiveness. And together, ideally even reach a point.
That's really the first step to even opening the door to communication, is being aware of the ego defenses and
even to the point, if you can reach a point where you can call your partner out on that ego defense and say, that's an ego defense mechanism, not in an accusatory way, but to help each other, because you don't want to be the type of people that have this engagement in their relationship where you're constantly in a state of ego defensiveness, to be able to call each other out and appreciate if your partner is calling it out, because that's not your best self and who you want to be. That's the beginning of so many great places. The relationship can grow, love can grow, appreciation and respect can grow. But you have to pull away the power of the ego defense and the power of the inferior function over you before you can get to that point.
Maybe we need to do a separate podcast on that issue sometime.
Right. So a lot has been discussed here, but we thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been informative. Please feel free to continue to give us your comments and let us know what you like or what questions maybe we didn't answer, and we look forward to talking with you more in our next podcast.
Enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so in several ways. In addition to purchasing our books and personality tests, you can contribute through the support page on Personality Junkie. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution, you can do so through our Patreon page, which we link to in the footer of our website. Patreon supporters can enjoy a variety of benefits, such as access to unpublished material, complimentary copies of our upcoming books, as well as input on post and podcast topics. Your contributions make it possible for us to continue to provide quality posts and podcasts. Thank you for your support.